On the 28th of July, 1755, in the town of Halifax on the coast of what is now Nova Scotia, a colonial official named Charles Lawrence and his governing council made a decision and wrote it down. The decision did not concern an army. It concerned a people. Every Acadian family in the colony, farmers who had worked that coastline for generations, was to be loaded onto ships and removed. Their houses would be emptied. Their land would be handed to others. And the order authorizing all of it was a routine piece of colonial paper. Worst punishments in history. The largest of them were rarely the work of a mob on a single furious night. They were bureaucratic. Someone wrote them down. Someone signed them. Someone filed the copy in a drawer. We tend to picture the worst moments in history as chaos, as something that happened when order broke down. A great deal of the time it was the opposite. Order did not break down. Order is what did it. The machinery of a working state was pointed at a population and switched on. This episode is about 5 times a government decided that the answer to a problem was to punish an entire population. Not a person. Not an army. A whole people, defined by where they lived or what they were. These 5 cases span 3 centuries and 3 continents, and they share something that turns out to be the most important part of the story. In every single one of them, the power that ordered the punishment is gone today. And the people it was down from the oldest to the most recent. The last entry on the list ended within the lifetime of people watching this right now. One note before we start. This episode deals with events in which large numbers of people suffered and died. The point here is not the suffering itself. It is what came afterward, and what that tells us about how these things actually end. Number 5. The Highland Proscription. Scotland. 1746. 16th of April, 1746, near Inverness in the Scottish Highlands. It was the final defeat of the Jacobite Rising, an attempt to put a rival claimant on the British throne. The government won. And then the government did something that reached far past the men who had actually fought. Later that year, Parliament in London passed the Act of Proscription. The law's own title called it an act for the more effectual disarming the Highlands in Scotland, and for restraining the use of the Highland dress. In plain terms, it made it a crime to wear Highland clothing, the kilt and the tartan, and a crime to carry traditional Highland weapons. The penalties ran from fines all the way to transportation to a colony on the far side of the world. This was not aimed at a rebel army. The rebels had already been beaten. It was aimed at the visible identity of an entire region. The ordinary clothes a Highlander had worn his whole life were now, by law, a crime. Not the fighting. The clothes. Here is the aftermath. In 1782, 36 years later. And within a century of that repeal, the very clothing the state had tried to criminalize had become one of the most recognizable symbols of Scottish identity anywhere on earth. The tartan that a government once threatened people with prison and exile for wearing is now sold in shops across Scotland and worn with pride around the world. The law is a historical footnote. The kilt is a national emblem. The government that tried to erase the look of the Highlands is gone. Number 4. The Acadian Expulsion. North America. 1755. This is the order from the beginning of the episode. Between 1755 and 1764, Great Britain carried out the forced removal of the Acadians, a French-speaking people who had farmed the coast of the Canadian Maritimes for more than 100 years. Of an estimated 14,100 Acadians, approximately 11,500 were deported. Around 5,000 of them died of disease, of starvation, or in shipwrecks along the way. Families were put on boats and scattered down the Atlantic coast, to Europe, to the Caribbean, to distant coastlines far to the south. Whole communities that had stood for generations were emptied, and the people who had built them were somewhere out on the ocean. And here is where the story turns into something almost nobody planned. After nearly a decade of wandering, one group of Acadian exiles found its way to Louisiana. They settled in the bayous and the prairies of the south, and they stayed. Their descendants are the people known today as the Cajuns. An entire living culture, with its own food, its own music, and its own dialect of French, exists in the American South because of a deportation that was meant to make the Acadians disappear. The colonial administration that signed that order is long gone. Great Britain no longer governs Nova Scotia, and has not for a very long time. But if you drive through southern Louisiana today, you will hear the descendants of the deported speaking a version of the language their ancestors were expelled for. The expulsion. Origin story. Number 3. Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. United States. 1830. Congress passed, and President Andrew Jackson signed, the Indian Removal Act of the 28th of May, 1830. The act authorized the federal government to negotiate the removal of native nations living east of the Mississippi River, and to send them to land in the West. In practice, negotiation very often meant force. The Cherokee were one of several nations forced west under the act, and their removal is the most heavily documented of them. In May of 1838, federal troops and state militias began rounding up Cherokee families into stockades. By that November, groups of about 1,000 people each were walking roughly 800 miles overland to the west, straight into winter. A missionary doctor who traveled with them estimated that more than 4,000 died along the way, nearly a fifth of the entire Cherokee population. By March of 1839, the survivors had reached what was then called that march by a name usually rendered in English as the trail where they cried. The aftermath is the part the policy did not anticipate. The removal did not end the Cherokee. They rebuilt in what is now Oklahoma. The Cherokee Nation exists today, governs itself, and elects its own leadership. The United States government that ordered them out of the East has changed almost beyond recognition since 1830. A policy designed to clear a people off a map ended up guaranteeing that the people would still be on it, under their own name, long after the men who signed the removal were gone. Number 2. The South African War Camps. 1899 to 1902. Between 1899 and 1902, the British Army fought a bitter colonial war against the Boers, the descendants of Dutch settlers, in what is now South Africa. When the Boer fighters abandoned open battle and turned to guerrilla raids, the British changed strategy. They began emptying the countryside, and they confined Boer families and black Africans in a network of camps. The conditions inside those camps were catastrophic. Food and clean water were short, and disease moved through the crowded tents almost unchecked. In all, roughly 28,000 Boers, most of them women and children, died in the camps. Around half that number of black Africans died in separate camps of their own. These were civilians. Their deaths were not the outcome of a battle. They were the outcome of a policy of removal and confinement, applied to whole families for the actions of the fighters. 20th century. The camps closed when the war ended. The memory of them did not. It became one of the deepest grievances in South African political life, carried by families for generations and shaping the country long after the last camp was gone. And the empire responsible, the British Empire, one of the largest empires in history, no longer governs a single acre of South Africa. The camps outlasted the war that produced them. The bitterness outlasted the empire that built them. Soviet Ukraine. 1932 to 1933. This is the most recent entry on the list, and in some ways the most disturbing, because of how deliberate the machinery was. In 1932 and 1933, a famine tore through Soviet Ukraine. It has a name of its own, the Holodomor. What separates it from an ordinary famine is stated plainly by the research consortium that documents it. It was a famine caused by the policies of the Communist Party and the Soviet government. It fell in the middle of the Soviet campaign to force the country's farmers off their own land and onto collective farms. Grain was taken out of the countryside under state quotas. A law was introduced that made the taking of even a few stalks of grain from a collective field an act of sabotage, punishable by execution. As the villages starved, the ability to leave and find food elsewhere was cut off. Historians estimate that close to 4 million people in Ukraine died, most of them peasants, in roughly a year and a half. That is a rate of loss that is difficult to hold in the mind. It happened in peacetime, in one of the most powerful states on the planet, to that state's own citizens, as a matter of recorded policy. The aftermath is still unfolding in the present. In 2006, the Parliament of Independent Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada, passed a law declaring the Holodomor a genocide. A number of other countries, including Canada, have formally recognized it the same way. And the state that engineered the famine, the Soviet Union, one of the two most powerful countries on the planet, dissolved in 1991. If you saw the previous episode, you already know how fast that ending came once it started. The union that tried to break Ukraine through hunger is gone. Ukraine is still on the map, and it has written that famine into its own law as a crime that was done to it. Here is what these 5 punishments have in common. Every one of them was aimed not at a person but at a people. A culture, an ethnic group, a population defined by where it lived or what it was. Every one of them was carried out by a state with the power to do it and the paperwork to make it official. And every one of them ended the same way. The power faded. The regime that banned the tartan was repealed. The colonial governments that scattered the Acadians and removed the Cherokee no longer exist in the form that did those things. The empire that built the camps lost its empire. The union that engineered the famine came apart in a single winter. And the people, every single one of these peoples, are still here. The Scots. The Cajuns. The Cherokee. The South Africans. The Ukrainians. Punishment on this scale is almost always an attempt to erase. And the historical record is remarkably consistent about how that attempt turns out. The people marked for deletion tend to outlive the ones who ordered it. The punishers are the ones who end up in the past tense. That is not a comforting thought so much as a strange one. It does not undo anything. The Acadians still lost their homes. The 4,000 still died on the road west. The 4 million still starved. Outliving the power that hurt you is not the same as being spared it. But it is the thing that actually happens, over and over, and it is worth understanding why. A punishment aimed at a whole people has to succeed against every single one of them, and it has to keep succeeding, year after year, generation after generation, without stopping. No government has ever managed to hold that grip forever. Governments run out of time. Peoples, so far, have not. There is a smaller pattern hiding inside the large one. In every one of these cases, the punishment was written as policy. Careful language, official letterhead, a signature at the bottom of the page. Nobody who signed those orders wrote down the word cruelty. They wrote security. They wrote order. In one case they very nearly wrote agricultural policy. The distance between a routine administrative decision and one of the worst events of its entire century is sometimes only the size of the population the decision happens to apply to. So here is the question. 5 of these punishments share is that they looked completely normal on paper, procedural, official, filed and signed in triplicate. Then how would the people carrying one out actually know, while they were doing it, that this was the thing history would remember them for? Not later, with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, with only the information they had in front of them. Leave your answer in the comments. The next episode steps back from what people do to each other and looks at what the planet does to everyone. 5 natural disasters, floods and long droughts that did to entire civilizations what no army ever managed. Thanks for watching.